The solicitor's letter arrived on an October evening when the rain fell like ash. Evangeline Ashworth stood in the entrance hall of Blackthorn Manor, her traveling coat still damp, her hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of words written in careful legal script. Your great-aunt's sole beneficiary. Estate in perpetuity. Sealed room beneath the east wing. She had expected nothing. Her family had disowned her mother decades ago, severing ties with such finality that even their graves had been forgotten. Now, at 24, Evangeline possessed a manor she'd never seen, in a county she'd never visited, with debts she couldn't pay and prospects that had withered like roses left in a crypt. The hall stretched before her in shadow-laden darkness, lit only by the candles her temporary maid, Mrs. Hartwell, had reluctantly lit before retiring. The woman had refused to stay past nightfall, something about the manor's nature, its watching quality. Evangeline had dismissed the woman's superstitions, but now, alone in the suffocating silence, she understood what the old servant had meant. Blackthorn Manor didn't feel abandoned. It felt occupied by absence. The grand staircase curved upward into darkness. Oil paintings lined the walls, their gilded frames catching candlelight like watching eyes. Most were family portraits, stern ancestors with mouths set in disapproval, women in white gowns with pearls at their throats, children posed with the stiffness of death. But one painting arrested her completely. It hung in the primary parlor above the cold fireplace. The portrait was massive, nearly 7 feet tall, and rendered in oils so rich they seemed to move in the wavering candlelight. It depicted a man of perhaps 30, with sharp aristocratic features and eyes the color of winter storms. His hair was dark and slightly long, swept back from a forehead marked by a single silver scar. He wore clothing from another era, a velvet coat, the deep burgundy of old wine, clasped at the throat with an ornate cross of black iron. But it was his expression that stopped her breath, not the formal severity of the other portraits. This man looked as though he had paused mid-breath, as though he might speak at any moment. His eyes held a terrible knowledge, the look of someone who had witnessed centuries pass like leaves falling from a tree. And beneath that weary immortality, something else, a hunger that the artist had captured with disturbing accuracy, a hunger that looked directly at her. Evangeline moved closer, her candle casting new shadows across the canvas. The nameplate beneath the frame was tarnished, but she made out the inscription, Cassius Blackthorn, 1623. That was impossible. The painting was clearly centuries old. The canvas itself bore the cracks of age. The pigments had faded to that particular patina only time could create. Yet the style of dress suggested the 19th century, perhaps the late 18th. The date made no sense. She turned away, telling herself it was a mistake, a misremembered date. Yet as she moved toward the door, she couldn't resist one final glance. In the flickering candlelight, she would have sworn his eyes followed her. The sealed room was in the east wing, accessible through a door disguised as paneling in the library. Evangeline found it by accident, and searching for anything that might explain the manor's strange atmosphere or her great-aunt's cryptic final wishes. The solicitor had instructed her to leave it undisturbed until the new moon, a condition so peculiar she'd initially dismissed it as the eccentricity of an old woman's final testament. But the key had been in the envelope, wrapped in paper marked with a single word, protection. She didn't use it tonight. Instead, she carried her candle through the library's labyrinth of shelves, reading titles by the wavering light. De Hereticis Male, The Book of Shadows, Codex Vampyrus, Dissertatio on Sanguine Magic. Her blood chilled. These were not the books of a rational woman. Thunder cracked against the windows, and Evangeline abandoned her exploration, retreating to the master bedroom, the only warm room in the manor where a fire still smoldered in the grate. She changed into her nightgown and lay beneath the heavy velvet curtains of the four-poster bed, listening to the storm rage outside. Sleep came in fragmented pieces. She dreamed of eyes the color of winter storms, dreamed of a hand, pale and elegant, reaching toward her throat, dreamed of a voice like midnight bells, like the last note of a funeral dirge, whispering a name that wasn't hers but felt like an answer to a question she'd been asking her entire life. She dreamed of blood. At midnight, she woke. The storm had passed. Moonlight poured through the windows in silver torrents, and her room was luminous, almost underwater. She lay in the center of that pale glow, her heart beating too quickly, her skin feverish. It was then she noticed it. Framed in the mirror above the vanity, impossibly, was the portrait from the parlor downstairs. Not reflected in the glass, actually present in the reflection, as though the parlor existed simultaneously in the mirror's dimension. And the man's eyes were open now, fully aware, staring directly at her through the layers of glass and shadow. Evangeline gasped and spun around. The mirror showed only her own pale face, her tangled dark hair, the rumpled bedding behind her. When she turned back to the mirror, the portrait was gone. The frame held only candlelight and shadow. She sat on the bed's edge, trembling, trying to convince herself it had been a dream. But the dream had held the weight of premonition, the terrible clarity of prophecy. And as the moonlight shifted across her skin, she felt it, a presence in the manor. Not threatening, but aware, not malevolent, but watching. In the parlor below, the portrait's eyes remained fixed on the darkness, as they had for 3 centuries, waiting. The compulsion began the following morning. Evangeline woke to find herself standing in the hallway outside the sealed room, barefoot and in her nightgown, with no memory of leaving her bed. Moonlight still silvered the windows. Dawn was hours away, and her fingers ached from gripping the portrait's key so tightly that crescents of blood marked her palms. She had no recollection of retrieving it from the envelope. The key itself was ancient, wrought from black iron and shaped like a cross intertwined with thorns. It burned cold in her hand, though whether from exposure to night air or from something else, she couldn't say. The library door before her stood ajar, and beyond it, she could see the hidden panel outlined in faint light. "No," she whispered to the darkness, "not yet." But her feet did not obey. They carried her forward, drawn by a gravity she couldn't name. The key rose toward the lock despite her conscious resistance, as though her body had become a puppet animated by some force outside herself. She wrenched her hand back, gasping, and the key fell to the carpet with a sound like a bell tolling. The touch of cold iron against wood echoed through the manor, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt a response. A presence, ancient and terrible, pulling against the boundaries that contained it. She felt hunger like a physical force, felt longing so profound it nearly dragged her to her knees. Then it was gone, leaving only the ordinary silence of an old house settling. Evangeline fled back to her bedroom, locked the door, and sat shaking by the window until dawn crept pink and gold across the grounds. When full daylight came, the compulsion faded to a dull ache behind her ribs, not gone, but dormant, like something sleeping, like something waiting. Over the following days, the pull grew stronger. It manifested in strange ways. She would find herself drawn to windows on the north side of the manor, staring toward the overgrown gardens where shadow pooled beneath ancient yews. She would discover herself in the library without clear memory of entering, her hands trembling as they reached for the books on forbidden magic. At night, she dreamed in vivid, sensual detail, dreams that left her gasping and flushed, dreams of a voice like velvet and ash, speaking words in a language that predated English, but which some deep part of her understood. "Come. You are mine. You have always been mine." The dreams were erotic in a way that should have mortified her, yet she found herself burning for them, waiting for sleep with desperate longing. In those visions, she felt understood in a way no living person had ever understood her. The man with winter storm eyes looked at her as though she were the answer to an eternal question, as though her very existence justified centuries of torment. It was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous, yet she could not stop. On the 5th night, the portrait appeared in her mirror again. This time, she didn't turn away. She sat before the glass, candlelit and trembling, and watched as his image became clearer, more solid. She could see the fine thread of silver scar tissue across his forehead, could see the elegant bones of his face, could see the terrible sadness in his eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered to the reflection. His lips moved. She read them rather than heard them. "Your master, your doom, your salvation." "Are you real?" "As real as the blood in your veins." Evangeline's hand rose to her neck, where she'd noticed the past 2 mornings a faint mark, like a bruise, but shaped like a mouth, like teeth. She'd told herself it was a dream mark, her own nails scratching in sleep, but the shape was too precise, too deliberate. "Why are you bound to this place?" she asked the mirror. For a long moment there was no answer. Then, "Because I am cursed, and because you are the curse's only remedy." "I don't understand." The mirror fractured, not the glass itself, but the image within it, splintering like a struck bell into 1,000 overlapping versions of his face, each one screaming silently. She threw herself backward, and the mirror's surface stilled, showing only her own pale reflection. Her heart hammered against her ribs. When she looked again, he was gone. The sealed room became an obsession. She began researching Blackthorn Manor's history in the library, piecing together fragments from old journals her great-aunt had left scattered among the volumes. The entries were sporadic, spanning decades, written in a hand that grew increasingly frantic. June 1887. The binding weakens with each moon cycle. The wards hold, but I feel him pressing against them. He does not hunger, or perhaps he hungers only for her, and she does not come. March 1902. My bloodline carries his mark. Every woman born to Blackthorn women bears it, though we do not bleed his blood. The prophecy is clear. When she is born, who shares both the mark and the will to accept him, the covenant will break. October 1923. I have arranged everything. The manor will pass to my great-niece. If my calculations are correct, she will be born in the year he described, the year his curse reaches its apex. God forgive me, I bind him still, but not for much longer. The final entry was dated 3 weeks before her great-aunt's death, November 1934. She is coming. I feel it in my blood, in the very stones of Blackthorn. The manor sings with anticipation. Soon the choice will be hers, to free him or to condemn him further. Either way, the seal will break. Either way, her blood will decide the fate of us all. Evangeline's hands shook as she set down the journal. She understood finally why the solicitor had insisted she not open the sealed room until the new moon. New moon was 2 nights away. 2 nights until the binding weakened to its nadir. 2 nights until whatever was locked beneath Blackthorn Manor could push through with full force. That night, she didn't try to sleep. She sat in the parlor before his portrait, the black iron key on her lap, her candle burning low. She studied his face for hours, searching for answers in the painted planes of his cheekbones, in the terrible knowledge held in his eyes. "What will happen if I open the door?" she asked aloud. The portrait didn't answer, but she felt him nonetheless, a pressure against her mind like a hand pressing gently against glass. Waiting. Patient. Eternal. "Will you hurt me?" She felt the answer before it came. "Only if you ask me to." "Do you love me?" The silence that followed was the most agonizing of all. When his answer finally came, it was not in words, but in sensation, a flood of feeling so profound it stopped her heart. She experienced a fragment of his immortality, centuries of loneliness, of isolation so complete it had burned away everything but hunger and hope. She felt the moment he first saw her through his mirror, felt the shock of recognition, felt his dead heart, truly dead, she understood, not merely sleeping, attempt to beat again. And she understood, with terrible clarity, that he had been waiting for her across 300 years, that she was not the first to be called here, but she was the first to answer. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Good," came his voice through the darkness. "Fear means you understand what it means to choose me. Fear means your choice will matter. And if I choose to leave, if I lock the door and never return?" For the first time, she felt doubt from him. Fear. The terrible vulnerability of something powerful rendered helpless by hope. "Then I remain bound, and the manor remains haunted. and you will spend your life fleeing a hunger that will never fade, because part of you will always recognize part of me. We are kindred, Evangeline. We have been since before your birth. Outside, the wind rose, the candles flickered, and in the shadows of Blackthorn Manor, something ancient and beautiful and terrible held its breath, waiting for the seal to break. The new moon arrived on a night of absolute darkness. Evangeline had not slept in 30 hours. She'd spent the daylight confined to her room, listening to the manor's voice. And yes, it had a voice now, a low thrumming that resonated through the floorboards and walls, the sound of ancient magic straining against its chains. The wards that bound the sealed room pulsed like a dying heartbeat, strong, then weak, then barely present at all. By dusk, she could feel him everywhere, not threatening, never threatening, but present, like a scent she couldn't quite identify, like a word on the tip of her tongue, like a phantom touch along her skin that made her nerves sing. The black iron key had grown warm in her pocket, almost alive, almost calling. At midnight, she descended to the sealed room. The library was candlelit, though she'd left no candles burning. Someone, something, had prepared the way. The hidden panel stood wide, and the door beyond it was open just enough to spill a thin sliver of violet light onto the carpet. The darkness exhaled from that opening like breath, like invitation, like surrender. Evangeline stepped through. The sealed room was not a room at all, but a crypt. It stretched beneath the east wing in a cathedral of stone, supported by pillars carved with symbols she recognized from her great-aunt's journals. Binding runes, ward circles, blessed salt lines traced in silver. The air tasted of earth and age and something else, something like copper, like the inside of a wound, like blood that had been spilled in ritual and never cleaned away. But it was the sarcophagus that held her attention. It was massive, carved from black marble veined with silver, and positioned in the center of the crypt like a throne. Its lid was carved with the same runes as the pillars, and atop it lay a figure rendered in stone, a man in medieval armor, his hands crossed over his heart, his face rendered with such skill that she could see the details of his noble features even in the violet darkness. Except his eyes were open, and they were watching her. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." The stone figure didn't move, but the temperature dropped so sharply her breath frosted in the air. The runes on the sarcophagus began to glow, faintly at first, then with increasing intensity, casting the crypt in a light like captured starlight, and where the light touched, the stone began to crack. Not violently, gently, like ice thawing in spring. Evangeline backed toward the stairs, but her feet wouldn't obey. She was rooted, watching as hairline fractures spread across the marble like veins, like the branches of some terrible tree growing toward the surface. The violet light intensified, and she understood that this light was coming from him, burning through the stone that had contained him, transforming his prison into a chrysalis. The sarcophagus split. It fell away in pieces, marble shattering against stone with a sound like breaking bells, and he rose from the darkness like something born from the earth itself. His body was pale, not white, but the absolute absence of color, as though sunlight had never touched his skin. He wore the medieval armor still, but it fell away as he moved, dissolving like ash, leaving him bare to the violet light. He was beautiful in the way a predator is beautiful, perfect and terrible, and made entirely for death. Evangeline. Her name in his voice was a prayer, a curse, a wound reopening. You came. His eyes were the color of winter storms, exactly as she'd seen them in the portrait, in the mirror, in her dreams. But there was something else in them now, something raw and desperate and ancient beyond measure. He looked at her as though she were the only real thing in the world, as though everything else, the crypt, the earth above them, the centuries behind him, was shadow and illusion. I don't... She couldn't finish. Words were impossible. He descended the steps of the sarcophagus, slowly, deliberately, giving her time to flee. She didn't flee. She couldn't have moved if the manor itself had begun to collapse. "Do you know what I am?" he asked. "A vampire?" The word felt obscene, too small for the majesty and horror of him. "Once, yes? Now?" He paused a few feet away, his head tilted as though listening to something only he could hear. "Now I am a curse given form. A man who loved a woman 3 centuries ago, who was transformed by a witch's vengeance into something that could not hold her without destroying her. I cannot walk in daylight without agony. I cannot taste food. I cannot feel warmth or sunlight or the ordinary comfort of being alive. But I can feel hunger. That I feel perfectly." He gestured to his neck, and she saw it, a scar identical to the mark on her own throat, but larger, deeper, shaped like a mouth that had bitten and never let go. "She marked me before she died in my arms. The witch who cursed me swore that I would walk the earth until I found another marked with the same blood sign, and only when I drank from her without destroying her could I be freed. 300 years, Evangeline. 300 years of searching, of binding myself to this manor, of watching through mirrors and portraits for the one who would bear the mark and survive the bite." He moved closer, and she could smell him now, old stone and winter wind and something dark and sacred, like the inside of a crypt, like incense burned at a funeral mass. "Your great-aunt was marked," he continued softly, "and her mother before her, and her mother before that. But none of them were strong enough. I would drink, and their light would flicker out like a candle, and I would return to the manor, damned for another generation. But you—" He reached out, and his fingers traced the edge of her jaw with a touch so gentle she almost wept. "You are different." "How?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Because you came willingly. Because you chose to understand rather than flee. Because somewhere in your blood, there is a strength that matches mine." His eyes dropped to her throat, where the mark he'd left pulsed like a second heartbeat. "And because when I bit you in the mirror dreams, you didn't break. You awakened." She felt his fingers slide down to her collarbone, felt his breath, cold, necessary as winter, against her skin. Every nerve screamed, but not in fear, in recognition, in hunger that matched his own. "If you drink from me," she heard herself say, "what happens?" "I am freed from the curse," he whispered, "and you become eternal. You become mine. You become undead, neither living nor fully dead, bound to me through blood and soul and the magic that brought us together." His lips found her throat, hovering just above the mark he'd already made. She felt his fangs, just the tips, just enough to pierce the skin, and tasted copper on her tongue. "Stop!" she gasped. He stopped immediately, pulling back, his eyes wild with the effort of restraint. "Not yet," she breathed. "Not until I understand what I'm choosing." For the first time, he smiled. A terrible, beautiful smile that showed the full length of his fangs, that revealed the monster beneath the aristocrat. "Then let me show you," he said, and took her hand, leading her deeper into the crypt, into his darkness. The chamber at the crypt's heart was not stone, but marble, pale as bone, veined with gold that caught the violet light and transformed it into something liquid and alive. At its center stood an altar, and above it a mirror framed in obsidian. Cassius led her to it, his hand never leaving hers, his touch neither warm nor cold, but somehow necessary, as though the boundary between her skin and his had already begun to dissolve. "Look," he whispered. In the mirror, they stood together for the first time. She was small beside him, her dark hair falling past her shoulders in tangled waves, her nightgown pale against the darkness. He was composed of shadow and starlight, his form almost translucent in the violet glow, beautiful and wholly inhuman. Where they touched, palm to palm, the air shimmered as though the boundary between their bodies was permeable, as though they might merge if they pressed any closer. "I am afraid," she said to their reflection. "Of me? Of becoming something that will never see daylight again, of losing myself to hunger, of becoming damned." Cassius turned her to face him, his winter eyes searching hers. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, Your great-aunt spent her life believing she could save me through binding magic. Your grandmother before her spent decades in prayer, asking God to break my curse. And your mother—" His voice broke slightly. "Your mother begged me to take her instead of you, the night before she died. She knew what you would be born to, and she tried to shield you from it." Evangeline's heart shattered. She knew? The Blackthorn women have always known. The blood mark is passed down through generations, a promise and a prophecy written in your very cells. He cupped her face in his hands, his palms cool against her cheeks. "But you are the first who was told. You are the first who came with full understanding. And therefore, you are the only one who can choose freely." "What do you choose?" she asked. "If I refuse?" "Then I remain bound to this crypt for another generation, perhaps another century, until another woman bears the mark. And you walk away with your humanity intact and spend your life wondering why you can never feel completely alive, why sunlight tastes like ash, why no mortal lover can touch the part of you that recognizes me." He released her face and stepped back, creating distance that felt like a chasm. "But if you accept, Evangeline, if you let me drink from you and join your blood to mine, we are eternal. Not in the way mortals understand it, not in the way priests promise heaven. We are eternal in hunger and in need and in a connection so profound that solitude becomes impossible. We would be each other's salvation and damnation both. You would see centuries pass. You would watch the world transform, and you would do it tethered to a man who will forever be half monster." She moved toward him instead of away. With each step, she felt something inside her crystallizing, a knowledge that ran deeper than thought. This was not seduction. This was destiny, wearing the face of choice. "I want to feel alive," she whispered. "I have never felt alive." "Then drink from me first." He offered his wrist, and she saw the veins beneath his translucent skin, not red, but silver, pulsing with something that was not blood, but something far older. She hesitated, and he smiled. A gentler smile this time, almost sad. "It will not taste like blood," he said softly. "It will taste like memory, like centuries, like love that has nowhere else to go." She brought his wrist to her lips. The moment her mouth touched his skin, the crypt transformed. The stones fell away, and she stood in a garden beneath a moon that was too large, too bright, casting everything in silver. Cassius was there, younger, pre-curse, with warmth in his skin and light in his eyes, and a woman in a white gown who looked at him with a devotion that could move mountains. Margaret, she understood through the blood memory, the one he loved, the one he could not save. She saw their first meeting at a masquerade ball in Prague, saw his hand take hers in a garden where roses bloomed eternal, saw the moment he turned her without permission, thinking immortality would protect her, not understanding that his curse would not allow her to survive it, saw her die in his arms, brilliant and burning, her light extinguished by the very love that created it, saw 300 years of isolation so profound it had carved away everything but need. When the vision released her, she was on her knees, tears streaming down her face, understanding him in a way that language could never convey. She had felt the weight of his centuries. She had experienced the specific texture of his despair. "Now you know," he said, helping her to her feet. "Now you understand what you are choosing." "Yes," she breathed. He guided her to the altar, where he arranged pillows of velvet, where candles appeared as though summoned by the violet light itself. He laid her down gently, and she understood, with the clarity of prophecy, that this was the moment everything would transform. "It will hurt," he warned, positioning himself over her, his fangs fully extended, his eyes luminous in the darkness. "But only for a moment. After that, you will feel more alive than you have ever felt." She nodded, and he lowered his mouth to her throat. His fangs pierced the mark his dream self had created, and the world exploded into sensation. It was agony and ecstasy braided together, was drowning and flying simultaneously. She felt her blood leave her body, not weakening, her but awakening her, each drop that he drew igniting nerves she didn't know she possessed. She felt the moment her mortality began to burn away. It was like shedding a skin that had never fit properly. Her heartbeat slowed, then slowed again, until it matched the rhythm of his own eternal pulse. Her vision sharpened until she could see the individual threads in the velvet beneath her, could count the flames in each candle, could sense the pulse of magic running through the stones themselves. And when he opened his wrist above her mouth and offered his blood, silver and ancient and tasting of starlight and sorrow, she drank. She drank like she had been born thirsty, and with each swallow she felt the final threads of her humanity snap and reform into something other, something beautiful, something damned. When it was finished, she lay in his arms as the violet light slowly faded to ordinary darkness. Her heartbeat was barely perceptible, her breath no longer necessary, her body transformed into something crystalline and eternal. She could feel him, not just physically, but spiritually, a presence in her mind that was as intimate as her own thoughts. "Welcome to forever," he whispered against her hair, and she heard the smile in his voice. She opened her eyes and saw in perfect detail the small scar on his neck. Margaret's mark, the wound that had never healed, the proof of his eternal curse. She understood finally that his curse had always been calling her into existence. That destiny had woven their souls together 300 years before her birth, and that she had never truly had a choice at all. 3 days passed in the crypt, though Evangeline couldn't have measured time in any conventional sense. Hours and moments had become fluid things, stretching and contracting according to some new rhythm she didn't yet understand. Cassius had taught her the basics of her new existence, how to move without making sound, how to see in absolute darkness, how to hear a heartbeat from 3 rooms away, how to hunger. But it was the memories that truly transformed her. They came unbidden, erupting through her consciousness like blood through a vein. Not her memories, but ancestral ones. Experiences lived by women whose names she barely knew, whose lives had been sacrificed to a curse that wasn't theirs to bear. She saw Margaret Blackthorne in 1723, a peasant girl who had caught the eye of the young noble Cassius. She had not been chosen. She had been taken. She saw the moment his fangs descended, the moment his curse hunger consumed all reason, the moment her light fractured and died in his arms. She felt Margaret's final thought, a whisper of forgiveness, even as her blood ceased to flow. Then she saw the witch. The witch's name had been Isabeau, and she had loved Cassius first. For decades she had waited for him to notice her, to choose her over the peasant beauty he'd elevated to nobility. When Margaret died in his arms, when her body crumbled to ash on the marble altar, Isabeau had appeared from the shadows of Prague's oldest cathedral and wove the curse that would bind him forever. "You wanted eternity with one woman," Isabeau had hissed, her ancient voice dripping poison. "Then walk eternity, searching for her echo. Drink from those who share her blood, and watch them burn in your arms. Only when you find one strong enough to survive your hunger, one who bears the mark willingly and loves you despite the monster, will you be freed. Until then, drink deep, noble lord. Drink forever. Drink alone." The curse had been intricate, woven with magic that predated Christian civilization. It wasn't merely binding Cassius to the manor. It was binding the Blackthorne bloodline to him, weaving their descendants into a tapestry of predestination. Every woman born to that line would carry Margaret's blood mark. Everyone would be drawn to him eventually. Everyone would face the choice to save him or condemn him further. Cassius found her in the marble chamber 3 days after the binding, lying on the altar with her hands over her face, overwhelmed by centuries of inherited trauma. "The memories will settle," he said, gathering her into his arms. "The first week is the hardest. Your mind is integrating 300 years of accumulated experience. It will feel like drowning." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" she gasped. "Why didn't my great-aunt explain what I would experience?" "Because understanding it intellectually and experiencing it are different things entirely. She tried to shield you as much as she could." He carried her up the spiral stairs toward the library, but she also left you journals, explanations, everything you need to understand your bloodline's burden. The manor above the crypt had transformed in the daylight hours. Cassius had unlocked every room, lit every candle, prepared the space as though expecting guests, or preparing for something else, a farewell perhaps, or a coronation. The library's forbidden section was now displayed openly, ancient grimoires arranged on dark velvet, their pages marked with annotations in her great-aunt's careful hand. Evangeline spent the daylight hours reading while Cassius slept, a sleep so deep it was nearly death, his body becoming almost marble-like, his breathing ceasing entirely. She learned that the Blackthorn curse was older than Cassius himself, that it had originated not with Isabeau, but with a medieval monk who had tried to preserve a lover's soul through dark magic and succeeded only in creating a prison. Cassius had been infected with that curse long before Margaret ever fell in love with him. Isabeau had simply weaponized it, turned his already fractured nature into an instrument of eternal punishment. The witch had done something else, too. She had intertwined her own blood with the curse magic, ensuring that only a woman descended from Isabeau's own lineage could ever break the binding. And Evangeline, as she read, deeper understood the terrible truth. The Blackthorn women weren't descended from Margaret. They were descended from Isabeau. Generations of the witch's offspring, hidden, renamed, reborn into respectability, all carrying the witch's ancient blood in diluted form, all marked from birth to either save Cassius or damn him further. It was a trap woven across 3 centuries. When she found the final journal entry, dated the day her great-aunt died, Evangeline's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped it. I have done everything I can to prepare her. The manor is hers. The seal will break when she reaches her 24th year, which is the age at which Isabeau said the curse could be broken. If Evangeline is strong enough, if she loves him despite the darkness, the binding will shatter. Cassius will be freed, and she will become what I could never become, his equal in immortality, his partner in eternity, not his victim. But if she is not strong enough, if she rejects him, or if his hunger consumes her, then the cycle continues. Another generation will bear the mark. Another woman will be drawn to the manor. God forgive me for what I have put in motion. God forgive us all. She knew, Evangeline whispered to the darkness. She knew everything, and she let me come anyway. Cassius emerged from the shadows. He had woken early, sensing her distress. He took the journal from her trembling hands and read the final entry in silence. She loved you, he said finally. That's why she did it, because she knew that you were the one who could survive this, that you were the one I could not destroy. How could she know that? Evangeline turned away from him, her new body vibrating with rage and sorrow and a hunger that had nothing to do with blood. How could anyone know such a thing? The blood mark, Cassius said softly. It doesn't just bind us. It lets us see each other across the generations. Your great-aunt felt you before you were born, Evangeline. She felt your strength. She felt your ability to love something monstrous without being consumed by it. That's why she chose you. That's why she prepared the manor, the journals, the key. She sacrificed me, Evangeline said bitterly. She freed you, Cassius corrected. You were never meant to live an ordinary life. The mark ensured that. The only choice was whether you would accept your nature or spend your existence running from it. A sound interrupted them, a sound like shattering glass, but deeper, more resonant. Both of them froze. Cassius's face went pale, paler than it already was, and Evangeline felt fear spike through her newly formed bond. What is that? She whispered. The second seal, he said, and his voice held no hope. There was always a second seal, woven by the witch herself as insurance. The first seal bound me to the manor, but this one... Another sound of breaking, this time from the direction of the east wing. This one was meant to bind you, Evangeline, to ensure that even if you became immortal, you could never truly leave him. Through their blood bond, Evangeline felt it activate, a binding that was different from the one joining her to Cassius, but equally powerful. It threaded through her newly immortal body like chains, anchoring her to the manor, to him, to an eternity spent within these stone walls. She was no longer bound by choice. She was bound by destiny. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the manor walls, something ancient and merciless was awakening, responding to the seal's breaking like a predator sensing blood and water. What else didn't they tell us? Evangeline asked, feeling the weight of 300 years of secrets pressing down upon her. Before Cassius could answer, a knock came at the manor door, loud, deliberate, and accompanied by the scent of blessed silver and hunter's blood. Someone had come to collect the debt the curse demanded. The hunter stood on the threshold of Blackthorn Manor like a priest at the gates of hell. She was tall and lean, with silver hair braided with blessed cord, and eyes that burned with the particular zealotry of someone who had spent a lifetime pursuing a single purpose. A cross of wrought iron hung at her throat, not for protection, but as a weapon. Her hands were scarred with symbols burned into the flesh itself, runes of banishment and binding inscribed in what could only be blood. Cassius Blackthorn, the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of vendetta. I am Margot Inquisitor, descendant of the order that has hunted you since Prague. I have come to end this. Evangeline felt Cassius tense beside her, felt the predator beneath his aristocratic facade wake and recognize a genuine threat. Through their bond, she tasted his fear, not of death, which he was already beyond, but of losing her. The hunter's presence alone could shatter the fragile balance of their newly formed covenant. You are not welcome here, Cassius said, his voice dropping into registers that seemed to resonate from the earth itself. This is a place of binding, not of judgment. I know exactly what this place is. Margot stepped inside without invitation, and the blessed cord around her wrist began to glow. I know about the curse, the witch, the women sacrificed. I know about Margaret Blackthorn and the 300 years of suffering, and I know about her. Her burning eyes fixed on Evangeline. The final choice, Margot continued. The woman who would either save or damn him eternally. Tell me, girl, do you understand what you have done? Do you understand what you have become? Evangeline opened her mouth to answer, but Cassius moved first, positioning himself between them with inhuman speed. His fangs descended fully, his eyes blazing with the light of his curse, and for the first time, Evangeline saw him as the hunter saw him, not as a tragic lover, but as a creature of absolute predation. His skin darkened, shadows gathering around him like living things. His fingers elongated into claws that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality. This was what he had been before Margaret, before love, before the veneer of aristocracy. This was the true nature of his curse. I will not let you harm her, he snarled, and the manor itself seemed to respond, walls groaning, candles flaring, the very air becoming thick with ancient power. Harm her? Margot laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Child, I am trying to save her. Can't you feel it yet? Can't you feel the second seal activating in your bones? The witch didn't just bind you to him, she bound you to this place. You will never walk in sunlight again. You will never leave these grounds. You will spend eternity as his prisoner, wearing the face of a lover. She came willingly. Cassius spat. She came ignorant, Margot countered. She raised her hand, and the runes on her palm began to bleed. The Order has studied your curse for 3 centuries, Blackthorn. We know its mechanics better than you do. Yes, a woman strong enough to survive your bite can theoretically free you, but the witch ensured a fail-safe. The moment a woman chooses you, the manor becomes a cage. The second seal is unbreakable. She cannot leave. She cannot refuse you. She cannot do anything but exist in your hunger forever. Through their blood bond, Evangeline felt Cassius's shock. He hadn't known. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He had believed the binding was only for him, that she would have the freedom to choose him again every night, that their covenant was built on mutual desire rather than magical compulsion. That's not true, Evangeline heard herself say. She stepped forward, moving from behind Cassius, and felt the second seal tighten around her like invisible hands. But it was different from what Margot described. It didn't feel like a cage. It felt like completion, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. "You don't understand what you've done," Margot said, not unkindly. There was almost pity in her burning eyes. "Come with me. Leave this place. I have ways to break the seal, rituals that can sever your bond. You can reclaim your mortality, your freedom." "No." The word came from somewhere deep within Evangeline's transformed body. She felt the truth of it resonate through her entire being. The seal wasn't a cage, it was an anchor. And she realized, with the clarity that only 300 years of ancestral memory could provide, that Margot was wrong about the witch's intent. Isabeau hadn't created a failsafe, she had created a condition. "The seal only activates if I accept him," Evangeline said slowly, understanding unfolding like a dark flower. "My great-aunt tried to warn me. She said I had a choice, and I did. I chose to transform, to drink his blood, to bind myself to him. The moment I made that choice, the seal activated because it required a willing acceptance. If I had rejected him, if I had used the key to destroy him, the seal would never have manifested." Cassius turned to stare at her. Through their bond, she felt his dawning comprehension. "The witch was not punishing you," Evangeline continued, her voice growing stronger. "She was protecting you. She made certain that the only way you could be freed was if someone loved you enough to want to be bound to you, that the woman who saved you would do so, knowing the cost and accepting it anyway. That way, your redemption wouldn't come from magic or circumstance, but from genuine love." "That's a poetic interpretation," Margot said coldly, "but it changes nothing. You are still caged. He is still a monster, and the Order still has a duty to end this abomination." She raised her scarred hand higher, and the runes began to glow with searing light. Around them, the manor's walls trembled. The binding magic, 300 years of accumulated power, began to fracture. But Evangeline felt it differently than Cassius did. Because she was new to immortality, because her transformation was still incomplete, she could sense the structure of the curse in a way even its victim couldn't. She understood its architecture, its vulnerabilities, its desperate beauty. And she understood what she had to do. Without thinking, without hesitation, she turned and pressed her wrist to Cassius's mouth. Not as a feeding, but as a covenant renewal. She felt his fangs pierce her skin, felt him drink the blood that now flowed with his own immortal essence, and through that intimate contact she poured everything into him. Her acceptance, her love, her understanding that the curse was not a punishment, but a test, and that in choosing to endure it with him, she had already passed. The manor blazed with light. It wasn't the violet light of his transformation, or the searing white of the hunter's runes. It was something older. Something that predated both curse and counter-curse. It was the light of the blood bond itself, the magic that bound two souls across eternity, and it was beautiful. Margot screamed as the light engulfed her, burning away the blessed cords, searing the hunter's runes from her palms. She staggered backward, her fanatic certainty cracking like porcelain, and the manor's doors opened behind her, not inviting, but expelling. "Go," Cassius said, his voice resonant with power that was no longer entirely his own. "Tell your order that the curse is no longer a curse. Tell them that Cassius Blackthorn has found his redemption, and that she is mine, and I am hers, and there is nothing in heaven or earth that can undo that binding." Margot fled into the darkness, and as her footsteps faded, Evangeline felt something fundamental shift within her. The second seal was no longer a chain, but a choice, renewed with every heartbeat, confirmed with every breath she didn't take. She was bound to Cassius and the manor. And for the first time in her new immortal existence, she understood that was exactly where she had always been meant to be. The summons came as blood in the mirror. Evangeline stood before the obsidian-framed glass in the marble chamber, watching her transformed reflection. Paler now, more ethereal, her eyes holding depths that hadn't existed 3 days ago, when crimson letters began to form across the surface, not written, but bled, as though something on the other side of the mirror was cutting itself open to communicate. "Cassius Blackthorn is summoned before the conclave of eternal thrones. The curse is acknowledged. The woman is acknowledged, but the bloodline must be verified. Come to the Cathedral of Shadows on the night of the waning crescent, or forfeit all claim to redemption." The blood faded, leaving only her reflection and the terrible knowledge that their isolation had ended. "The conclave," Cassius said quietly, appearing behind her as he always did now, moving through the manor's shadows like he was composed of them. "I had hoped we would have more time." "What is the conclave?" Evangeline asked, though part of her already knew, through the ancestral memories that still surfaced unbidden. Vampires of ancient power, the eldest of the immortal bloodlines, who govern the hidden world beneath the surface of human civilization. They were not tyrants, exactly. They were beyond tyranny. They were law itself, eternal and immutable. "The vampires who made the rules that bind us all," Cassius said. "I have avoided their judgment for 300 years, through the sealed manor and the binding curse. But now that the curse is breaking, now that you have accepted immortality willingly, they have every right to examine whether this covenant is legitimate or an abomination." "Is it?" Evangeline turned from the mirror to face him. "An abomination?" His expression, caught between anguish and something that might have been hope, told her everything. "The conclave doesn't care about morality, Evangeline. They care about precedent. They care about whether allowing one cursed vampire and his willing companion to exist threatens the stability of the hidden world. They will examine your bloodline, your transformation, your binding. And if they determine that we are a threat, they will separate us and likely execute us both. Then we don't go. We must. Refusal means immediate execution, and the destruction of Blackthorn Manor along with us. At least if we appear, we have a chance to argue our case." The Cathedral of Shadows was not a building, but a place, a location that existed in the margins between the mortal world and the vampire realm. It manifested on the waning crescent in the heart of London's oldest cemetery, beneath the crypt of a medieval cathedral that had been demolished 3 centuries ago. Cassius and Evangeline arrived through a pathway that unfolded from the darkness itself, descending into chambers carved from obsidian and bone. The conclave was already assembled. There were 7 of them, each radiating such accumulated power that Evangeline's newly immortal senses recoiled. They sat upon thrones of blackened silver, their appearances spanning centuries. One wore clothing from ancient Rome, another from Renaissance Venice, a third from an era so distant Evangeline couldn't place it. At the center sat an ancient vampire whose form seemed to flicker between different ages, as though she existed simultaneously across multiple centuries. "Cassius," the flickering elder said, her voice like wind through a crypt. "You have broken the seal." "The seal was broken by consent," Cassius replied, his voice steady despite the terror Evangeline felt radiating through their bond. "The woman chose transformation. The binding was accepted willingly by both parties. The woman," another conclave member leaned forward, "is descended from Isabeau. We can taste it in her blood. She is the witch's line. How do we know this is not another curse, another trap laid by the one who tormented you for 3 centuries? "Because Isabeau is dead," Evangeline heard herself say. Every eye turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their ancient regard like a physical force. But she continued, drawing on the memories that weren't hers but felt like her own. "She died in 1847, in Prague, with your blessing. She created the curse as punishment, yes, but also as a test that required someone strong enough to survive damnation and love enough to accept it. I am the first to do both. That was always her intention. Not to bind him forever, but to bind him to someone worth binding to." The flickering elder tilted her head. "You understand the witch's mind." "I carry her blood," Evangeline said. "I carry her knowledge, and I understand what she was trying to create. Not a punishment, but a redemption. Cassius was broken before the curse. The curse gave him purpose, gave him something to search for. It made him capable of love again. Love," a third conclave member said scornfully, "is an excuse mortals use to justify their weaknesses. It is not a legitimate foundation for covenant." "Then what is?" Evangeline challenged. What is a legitimate foundation? Power, hunger, survival? We have all three. And we have something else. We have the proof that our bond can withstand judgment, can survive the scrutiny of the eternal thrones themselves. Through their blood connection, Cassius was screaming at her to stop, to be silent, to not provoke the conclave further. But Evangeline felt something crystallizing in her transformed body, a clarity that came not from fear, but from absolute certainty. You are afraid, she said to the conclave. You are afraid that if you acknowledge our covenant, if you permit a cursed vampire and his willing companion to exist, it will challenge your authority. It will suggest that redemption is possible, that damnation can be transcended, that love might matter more than law. And if that becomes possible for one vampire, it becomes possible for all of them. Your entire order is built on the premise that we are damned, that we must accept our nature and rule through that damnation. We threaten that. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the flickering elder rose from her throne. Bring her forward, she commanded. Cassius moved to block her path, but Evangeline squeezed his hand and stepped toward the ancient vampire alone. This close, she could see the conclave member's true form. Not one age, but all ages simultaneously, as though she had lived so long that time had ceased to have meaning for her. What is your name? The elder asked. Evangeline Ashworth, born to the Blackthorn line, now bound to Cassius Blackthorn through blood covenant and willing transformation. The ancient vampire reached out and touched Evangeline's forehead with a single cold finger. The world exploded. She felt the elder's consciousness merge with hers. Examining her memories, her intentions, her love, she felt every moment of Cassius's isolation, every century of his suffering, every failed attempt to break his curse across generations of Blackthorn women. She felt the specific architecture of the witch's binding, understood finally its perfect symmetry, a curse designed to teach a monster how to love again. And she felt the elder's own ancient sorrow, the weight of 3,000 years spent governing a world of damned creatures, the loneliness of power that could never be questioned. When the contact broke, Evangeline fell to her knees. The covenant is legitimate, the flickering elder announced. The binding is true. Cassius Blackthorn is no longer under curse, he is under covenant. And this woman is no longer mortal, she is bloodbound and eternal. But another conclave member began. The decision is made, the elder said with finality. They will be permitted to exist as they are, but know this. She turned back to Evangeline. Your love will be tested. Eternity is long, and humans, even immortal humans, are fragile things. If you break this covenant, if you abandon him, the blessing becomes a curse again. Do you accept this? Evangeline looked back at Cassius, felt the hope and terror warring in his immortal heart. I do, she said, and meant it with every cell of her transformed body. The conclave dismissed them with a gesture, but as they turned to leave, the ancient elder spoke once more. Go back to your manor, Evangeline Ashworth. Go back to your darkness, and remember that some tests are never truly over. Some trials continue forever. They emerged into the waning crescent moonlight above the cemetery, alive and together and forever changed. Cassius pulled her close, his voice breaking as he whispered her name like a prayer. But Evangeline couldn't shake the elder's final words. Some trials never truly end. The change began in her bones. 3 weeks after the conclave's judgment, Evangeline woke to find her skin translucent as porcelain, her veins visible beneath the surface like rivers of quicksilver. The transformation from mortal to immortal should have been complete, but instead it was accelerating. She was becoming something other than human, something other than vampire, something that existed in the liminal space between predator and prey. And Cassius was starving. She could feel it through their bond, a hunger so profound it eclipsed everything else. Not for food, not for sustenance, but for her. The bond between them was consuming itself, feeding on the very connection that should have sustained him. The blood he had drunk from her at the conclave had been transformative, yes, but it had also awakened an appetite that even 3 centuries of isolation hadn't prepared him for. He was becoming addicted to her specific essence. "You need to feed on someone else," she told him one evening as they sat in the candlelit library. "Someone outside our covenant. It will ease the hunger." "I can't." His voice was hollow, his eyes fixed on the faint pulse visible at her throat. The curse was never about simple bloodlust. It was about specific hunger. For Margaret's line, for the blackthorn blood. "I can feed on other mortals, yes, but it satisfies nothing. I will only ever be truly sated by you." "Then we have a problem," Evangeline said, "because if you continue feeding from me at this rate, I will burn out. I can feel it happening." My mortality was the buffer between us. Now that I'm immortal, there's nothing to slow the consumption. I'm becoming fuel for your hunger instead of its salvation. Through the bond, she felt his despair, not the learned despair of centuries, but the fresh, raw despair of someone watching the one thing that redeemed him become the instrument of his damnation. "The elder warned us," Cassius said bitterly, "some trials never truly end." The crisis came on the night of the blood moon. Evangeline had been weakening for days, her newly immortal body struggling to sustain the level of feeding Cassius required. She had tried to hide it, had tried to continue their nights together as though nothing was wrong, but the bond between them was too intimate for deception. He could feel her dissolution as clearly as she could feel his hunger. On the night the moon hung bloated and crimson above Blackthorn Manor, she collapsed in the marble chamber, not from weakness, but from something worse, the beginning of what she recognized, through ancestral memory, as the fading. It was what happened to immortals who lost their grounding in the mortal world, who became untethered from the source that had created them. She was dying in a way no vampire had ever died, not from sunlight or blessed silver, but from the fundamental incompatibility of her nature with his need. Cassius found her as her consciousness was beginning to splinter, as the edges of her vision turned to shadow. "No," he said, and the manor shook with the force of his denial. "No, I will not lose you. I have not come this far, endured this long, only to watch you dissolve into nothing." He pressed his wrist to her lips, offering his own immortal blood, a reversal of their first covenant, a desperate attempt to anchor her to existence through his essence rather than hers. But she pushed him away. "It won't work," she gasped. "You're the hunger. Feeding on you will only accelerate the fading." "Then what?" His voice broke, became something primal and anguished. "Tell me what will save you. Tell me what I must do, and I will do it." Through the fog of her dissolution, Evangeline understood. The trial wasn't about whether their love could survive external judgment. It was about whether their love could survive the fundamental incompatibility of their natures, whether a predator could learn to feed on something other than his one source of sustenance, whether he could love her enough to hunger differently. "You must feed on death," she whispered. "Not life, not blood, death itself. The witch created your curse to teach you love, but love requires sacrifice. You must sacrifice your hunger. You must transform it into something else." "I don't know how," he said desperately. "Yes, you do." Her vision was almost entirely gone now, her consciousness fragmenting. "You've always known. You just refused to do it because it meant admitting that you were capable of change, capable of transcendence. The curse was your excuse. It gave you permission to remain a monster. But the curse is broken now. There is no excuse left." She felt him leave her, felt him move through the manor with inhuman speed. She heard him descend into the crypt, heard him scream. A sound of such primal anguish that it seemed to split the very fabric of reality. She heard him rage against 300 years of isolation, 300 years of hunger, 300 years of believing he was damned beyond redemption. And then she heard him sing. It was not a voice, but a vibration, a frequency that seemed to exist at the intersection of life and death. And as he sang, he drew something from the manor itself, not blood, not life force, but the accumulated death that lay beneath Blackthorn's foundations. 300 years of small creatures that had wandered into the crypt and never left, 300 years of natural decay, 300 years of the slow entropy that defined existence. He fed on that death, and in feeding on it, transformed his hunger into something that fed on cessation rather than vitality. When he returned to the marble chamber, his eyes were different, still the color of winter storms, still ancient and terrible, but no longer predatory in the way they had been. He had become something new, a vampire who sustained himself not on blood, but on the boundary between existence and non-existence. He knelt beside her fading form and took her hand. "Come back," he whispered. "Come back to me, and I will never hunger for you again. I will hunger for nothing but the privilege of your presence in my eternity." Evangeline felt his transformed essence reach toward her, felt him anchor her back to existence not through blood exchange, but through something deeper, through the vampire's true power, which was not hunger, but presence. He made himself a tether, a reason to remain embodied, a purpose for her continued existence. Slowly, agonizingly, she felt her body reconstitute. The translucence faded. The quicksilver veins beneath her skin darkened back to normal. Her consciousness, which had been scattered across 1,000 fragmentary moments, coalesced into singular awareness. She opened her eyes to find him weeping, tears of blood sliding down his aristocratic cheeks, each one a moment of genuine human emotion, breaking through centuries of controlled immortality. "I love you," he said, and it was the first time she had heard those words from him, spoken not through blood visions or cryptic prophecies, but as a simple truth. Not because of the curse, not because of the prophecy, not because of the binding. I love you because you are you, and you chose to see me, and you asked me to become something better. I love you. She pulled him close, and their hearts, both barely beating, both sustained by forces that had nothing to do with mortal physiology, beat in synchronization. In the marble chamber beneath Blackthorn Manor, surrounded by the accumulated magic of 3 centuries, a monster and a woman became partners, not savior and damned, not predator and prey, equals. The library was transformed. Where before it had held only shadows and secrets, it now held acceptance. Evangeline had opened every window to the moonlight, had arranged the forbidden grimoires in new patterns that seemed less like warnings and more like knowledge. The journals of her great-aunt, her grandmother, her mother, all the women who had carried the blood mark across generations, were displayed openly, their spines catching silver light. They were no longer documents of sacrifice. They were documents of choice. "My mother wrote this on the day I was born," Evangeline said, running her fingers along a passage in a leather-bound journal dated 1900. She read aloud, "I have felt him through the mark, felt his loneliness reaching across the years. Like a hand extended in darkness, I have decided not to warn my daughter about him. Instead, I will trust that if they meet, it will be because they are meant to. Love should not be hedged about with warnings. Love should be allowed to choose itself." Cassius stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression that had shifted from hunger to something far more complex. This new thing he had become, this creature that fed on death rather than life, was still adjusting to existence without constant want. It made him capable, for the first time, of being present rather than merely existing. "Your mother understood the curse better than I did," he said quietly. "She understood that the only way to break it was not through sacrifice, but through acceptance, through allowing someone to love me, despite knowing exactly what I was." "She paid for that understanding," Evangeline said. "She died protecting me, trying to shield me from knowledge that was always meant to be mine." She closed the journal and turned to face him fully. In the moonlight, they were mirror images of each other now, both pale, both luminous with the particular beauty of the immortal, both bearing the marks of their covenant written in their very blood. Yet where Cassius was sharp angles and aristocratic refinement, Evangeline had become something more fluid, more intuitive. She was the complement to his severity, the answer to his ancient questions. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Will you come?" He led her not deeper into the manor, but toward it, toward the highest tower, the one she had never entered, the one that seemed to exist partially outside the normal architecture of Blackthorn. They climbed narrow stone stairs that spiraled upward until the manor below became merely shadow and suggestion. At the top was a chamber open to the sky. It was a perfect circle, its walls constructed from mirrors of black glass that reflected the moonlight in infinite recursion. At the center stood an altar, made not of stone, but of crystallized starlight, and upon it lay two objects: a white gown that seemed to be woven from moonbeams, and a dagger of silver that glowed with its own internal luminescence. "What is this place?" Evangeline whispered. "This is where Margaret and I were meant to be bound," Cassius said. His voice held no regret, only a profound acceptance. "The witch created this chamber as part of the curse. She intended it to be the site of my eternal punishment, the place where I would watch as each marked woman chose me, then watch as my hunger destroyed her, a monument to my damnation." He moved to the crystallized altar and took the white gown in his hands. It seemed impossibly delicate, yet when he offered it to Evangeline, she understood through their bond that it was stronger than any armor, woven with magic that predated even the witch's curse. "Your great-aunt prepared this," Cassius continued. "She understood that if you survived, if you chose transformation, this chamber would need to serve a different purpose, not as a site of punishment, but as a site of commitment." Evangeline took the gown, and as she did, she felt the weight of 300 years of Blackthorn women press upon her shoulders, their hopes, their fears, their desperate love for a man they had never met but always understood. She was the culmination of their collective will, the answer to their collective prayer. "Will you wear it?" Cassius asked. She changed behind a screen of mirrors, and when she emerged, she was transformed, not into something human, but into something that transcended human entirely. The moonbeam gown clung to her immortal form perfectly, and as she moved, it seemed to trail starlight. She had never felt more powerful, more aligned with her own nature. Cassius was waiting at the altar, and he had changed as well. He wore robes of midnight blue, embroidered with the same runes that marked the chamber's walls. In his hands, he held not the silver dagger, but something else, a cord woven from silver thread and shadows, impossible to describe, but impossible to deny. "This is not a binding," he said as she approached. "You are not bound to me, but if you choose, we can acknowledge that we belong to each other, not through magic, not through curse, but through covenant freely made and freely renewed. Every night, you will have the choice to stay. Every night, I will have the choice to release you. But every night, I believe you will choose me as I will choose you." "Every night?" she asked. "Eternity requires renewal," he said. "It requires choice renewed in each moment. Otherwise, it becomes prison. But if you are willing to choose me every night for the rest of forever, then I am willing to believe that what we have is not damnation, but grace." She took the cord and felt it settle around her wrist, not tight, not binding, but present, a reminder rather than a restraint. When she looked at Cassius, she saw him place an identical cord around his own wrist, a mirror of her gesture. "I choose you," she said, "not because of the mark, not because of the prophecy, not because of any magic that came before. I choose you because you are the only person I have ever met who understands what it means to be broken and choose to heal anyway. I choose you because you are worth choosing." They stood before the altar as the midnight bells tolled from some distant cathedral, and the chamber itself seemed to acknowledge their covenant. The mirrors reflected not their images, but their souls. Evangeline's luminous and fierce, a creature of will and acceptance, and Cassius's ancient and tender, a monument to the possibility of transcendence. He took her hand, and they sealed the covenant not with blood, but with a kiss, their lips meeting in the moonlight, tasting each other for the first time without hunger, without compulsion, without anything but genuine desire to merge with another consciousness. When they descended the tower stairs, they were different than they had been. Not transformed by magic, but completed by choice. Cassius was no longer the cursed lord waiting for redemption. He was a man, ancient, powerful, shaped by suffering, but fundamentally capable of love. And Evangeline was no longer a woman marked by destiny. She was a woman who had seized her destiny and transformed it into something entirely her own. In the library below, she lit a candle and began to write in her own journal. The first entry of what would be an eternal record. The nights at Blackthorn Manor are mine now, not through compulsion, but through love. Every evening, when darkness falls, I choose him. Every evening, he chooses me. And in that renewal of choice, I find something I never expected to find in damnation: grace. Every night, we are reborn into covenant. Every night, we choose eternity together. And perhaps that is all love ever is: the choice to show up for each other again and again across all the nights that stretch ahead. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. Cassius took her hand and drew her toward the underground chambers, where they would sleep through the daylight hours, preserved in darkness, waiting for the next night when they could choose each other again. For now, this was enough. For now, this was everything. The summons came in blood again, but this time it was not written in a mirror. It was carved into the very foundations of Blackthorn Manor. Evangeline felt it first, a tremor that ran through the stone and mortar, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the sealed crypt beneath the east wing. The binding that had held Cassius for 300 years was fracturing, but not from decay or age. Something was breaking it deliberately, with purpose and power. She woke Cassius from his daylight sleep, and they descended together into the depths of the manor. The sarcophagus was glowing with a light that was neither violet nor white, but a sickly amber that pulsed like an infected wound. And standing before it, her hands pressed against the marble, was a woman who should have been dead for 3 centuries, Isabeau. The witch was not entirely present. Her form flickered between solidity and shadow, as though she existed only partially in the mortal realm. But her eyes were burning with an intensity that made even Cassius recoil. She wore clothing from no particular era, as though she had shed time itself, and her skin seemed to be made of the same marble as the sarcophagus, cold and unyielding. "You broke my work," Isabeau said, her voice like wind through a catacomb. "You broke the curse I spent 3 centuries perfecting." "The curse was meant to be broken," Cassius said, positioning himself between the witch and Evangeline. "You created it for that purpose, to teach me how to love again." "No." Isabeau's laugh was the sound of breaking glass. "I created it to teach you how to suffer, to teach you that love was a weakness that would be exploited forever. I created it so that every woman you touched would burn, so that you would spend eternity watching beauty turn to ash in your arms." She turned her burning gaze on Evangeline. But she broke it. She was not supposed to survive. None of them were supposed to survive. You were supposed to remain damned, Cassius, forever reaching for redemption you could never attain. Why? Evangeline stepped forward, despite Cassius's warning grip on her hand. If you wanted him to suffer, why create a curse with a loophole? Why include the possibility of salvation? Because, Isabeau said softly, I wanted him to know it was possible and believe it was impossible. I wanted him to hope and have that hope destroyed again and again for eternity. I wanted his suffering to have the particular flavor of almost redemption. The witch raised her hand, and Evangeline felt the second seal, the binding that had anchored her to the manor, begin to invert. Instead of anchoring her to Cassius, it was severing their connection, thread by thread, burning away the covenant they had forged in moonlight and choice. No! Cassius roared, and his form transformed. Not into the predatory creature he had been before, but into something new, something that was half death, half life, a creature composed of the very entropy he had learned to consume. He lunged for the witch, but Isabeau simply smiled and pulled. The manor itself responded to her will. The walls began to collapse inward, stone crushing stone, the architecture that had held for 3 centuries buckling under supernatural pressure. The seal didn't just sever, it exploded, and with it came a wave of power that sent both Cassius and Evangeline crashing backward. The binding is broken, Isabeau announced. The covenant is sundered, and now Cassius Blackthorn, you will watch as she burns. But nothing happened. Evangeline waited for the agony she had experienced in the marble chamber, the dissolution of the fading. It didn't come. Instead, she felt something different, a presence that was not Cassius's, but was undeniably connected to him. It was her own will, her own choice, manifesting as a tangible force. She had been bound to Cassius by the second seal, but she had been bound to herself by the covenant. "You're right," Evangeline said, rising to her feet as the manor crumbled around them. "The binding is broken. The seal that held me to this place is shattered. I am no longer compelled by magic to stay here." She looked directly at Isabeau, and in her eyes burned the light of 300 years of Blackthorn women, her mother, her grandmother, her great-aunt, all the ones who had carried the mark and endured the prophecy. "But I choose to stay anyway." Evangeline extended her hand toward Cassius, and as she did, she felt her immortal blood begin to sing. It was not a sound, but a vibration, the accumulated power of her lineage, the witch's own blood used against her own magic. The blood that had been cursed became a blessing. Cassius took her hand, and where their fingers intertwined, light erupted. Not the sickly amber of Isabeau's decay, but pure silver, the color of starlight and choice, and the specific beauty of free will. "This cannot be," Isabeau whispered, her form beginning to disintegrate. "I am eternal. I cannot be unmade by—" "By love?" Evangeline finished. "Yes, you can. You created a curse so intricate, so perfectly designed to corrupt genuine feeling into torture, that you wove redemption into its very structure. You gave him the possibility of salvation and then believed he would never reach it. But he did. Not because of the curse, but despite it." The witch screamed as the silver light engulfed her, not destroying her, but dispersing her, fragmenting her consciousness across the spaces between moments, binding her to the manor's stones where she would experience, for eternity, the presence of the love she had tried so desperately to prevent. The crumbling stopped. The manor stabilized. And in the silence that followed the witch's dissolution, Evangeline and Cassius stood together in the ruined crypt, still holding hands, still choosing each other. "The seal is broken," Cassius said wonderingly. "You could leave. You could walk away, live a mortal life, be free of the manor and of me." Evangeline looked around at the manor she had inherited, at the crypt that had been a prison and then a sanctuary. She felt the weight of the covenant she had renewed every night, the choice she had made again and again across weeks that felt like lifetimes. "I could," she agreed, "but I won't." She pressed her forehead against his, and through their bond, no longer compelled by magic, but flowing freely by choice, she poured everything into him, her certainty, her love, her complete and absolute decision to spend eternity in his darkness. "Why?" he whispered. "Because you taught me something that no mortal could ever teach me," she said. "You taught me that damnation is a choice, and redemption is a choice, and love is a choice, and every single night when I choose to stay, I am choosing to be. I am choosing to matter, and I would rather spend forever in the darkness of Blackthorn Manor with you than spend a single year in sunlight with anyone else." He kissed her then, in the ruins of the crypt, in the space where the witch's curse had finally been broken, and in that kiss was the answer to 300 years of questions. Not all curses could be broken by magic. Some could only be broken by choosing, again and again, to love the monster you became for the sake of someone worth transforming for. The manor was no longer haunted. That was the first thing Evangeline noticed as autumn turned to winter, as the seasons began their eternal rotation outside the walls that no longer held her captive. The shadows had lightened somehow, become less oppressive. The air no longer tasted of trapped magic and desperate longing. Blackthorn Manor had transformed from a crypt into a home. She stood in the tower chamber on the night of the winter solstice, looking down at the grounds that stretched below her in silver moonlight. Snow covered the overgrown gardens, transforming them into a landscape of crystalline beauty. Somewhere in those gardens, Cassius was walking, not hiding from the light anymore, but simply enjoying the darkness as the darkness itself, rather than as an absence. The covenant had changed after Isabeau's defeat. Without the seal's compulsion, Evangeline discovered she could leave the manor whenever she chose. She had tested this freedom 3 times in the weeks, following the witch's dispersal, walking through the gates, feeling the binding release her into the world. Each time, she had walked further, testing the limits of her independence, and each time, she had turned around and come back, not because she was bound, but because there was nothing in the world that called to her more than the darkness of Blackthorn Manor and the man who inhabited it. "I thought you might be here," Cassius said, appearing in the doorway with that characteristic silence he possessed. He had begun to change as well, in subtle ways. The terrible sorrow that had marked his eyes for 3 centuries was beginning to lift, replaced by something more complex. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace. The peace of someone who had stopped fighting his own nature. "I was thinking about leaving," Evangeline said, not turning from the window. She felt him go completely still, felt the spike of fear that shot through their bond before he controlled it. "I was thinking about it," she continued, "and I realized I don't want to. Not because I can't, not because I'm bound, but because I genuinely don't want to. I want to stay here, in this manor that has become mine, with you, for as long as forever lasts." She turned to face him, and in the moonlight she saw tears, actual tears, sliding down his aristocratic cheeks. Not tears of blood this time, but tears of genuine human emotion, the product of a heart that had finally learned to feel again. "Do you understand what you're saying?" he asked, his voice rough. "Eternity is a very long time. I have already lived 300 years, and I am nowhere near as weary of existence as you might expect. There will be centuries more, millennia, perhaps, and you will spend all of it here, in this single place, with me, watching the world change from behind these walls. Yes," she said simply, "I understand, and I choose it anyway." He crossed the chamber and pulled her close, and she felt the covenant pulse between them, not the magical binding that had compelled them, but the living, breathing bond of choice renewed. Every heartbeat was a choice. Every breath was a covenant. Every moment they existed together was an act of free will. "I have something for you," he said, drawing back slightly. From his pocket, he withdrew something wrapped in crimson silk. When he unfolded it, Evangeline saw a mirror, small and circular, framed in the same black iron as the key that had first opened the sealed room. But this mirror was different. It showed not her reflection, but his, Cassius, as he had been 300 years ago, before the curse, before Margaret, before damnation had reshaped his soul. "The witch bound me to her magic through mirrors," Cassius explained. "Through reflections, through the space between surfaces. But this mirror shows something different. It shows what I was before the curse consumed me. I want you to have it, not as a reminder of what I've lost, but as proof of what I've found." She took the mirror and looked into it, and instead of his past self, she saw something else entirely. She saw herself reflected there, not as she appeared now, pale and luminous and immortal, but as she had been the night she first descended into the crypt, young, terrified, desperate for meaning in a life that had felt empty. And beside her reflection was Cassius's image, no longer separated by time or curse or the terrible distance of incompatible natures. "We're the same in the mirror," she whispered. "We're the same everywhere now," he said. "We're no longer predator and prey. We're no longer cursed and cursed breaker. We're simply 2 people who chose each other, and in that choosing became something neither of us could have become alone." Over the following months, Evangeline settled into the rhythm of her eternal existence. She spent her days sleeping in the deep chambers beneath the manor, where darkness was absolute and dreamless. She spent her nights in the library, reading through generations of accumulated knowledge, adding her own journals to the collection her great-aunt had left behind. She wrote about the mundane beauties of immortal existence, the way moonlight changed through the seasons, the way Cassius's hand felt in hers, the specific texture of choosing someone again and again and never being disappointed. She also learned to hunt, not for the bloodlust that had nearly destroyed Cassius, but as a means of sustenance. Cassius taught her to feed on the margins of the mortal world, to take only what was freely given or what was already dying, to consume death rather than inflict it. It was a kind of grace, that ability to exist in the world without being a predator. On the night of the spring equinox, 6 months after Isabeau's defeat, the conclave sent a messenger. It was not Margot the hunter, but an ancient vampire dressed in clothes that seemed to exist outside of time itself. She came not with threats, but with respect, bowing before Evangeline as though greeting an equal rather than a newly made immortal. "The eternal thrones acknowledge what has transpired," the messenger said. "The curse is broken, the witch is bound, and Cassius Blackthorn, who has spent 300 years in isolated damnation, has been redeemed through the choice of one woman. It is unprecedented, it is remarkable, and it has changed the fundamental nature of what the conclave believed about redemption itself." She placed a sealed letter at Evangeline's feet and vanished back into the darkness. The letter contained only a single line, written in script so ancient it seemed to shift and change as she read it. "The trial is complete. You have proven that love is not weakness. You have proven that damnation can be transcended. You have proven that choice matters more than magic. Walk freely now, both of you. The conclave will trouble you no more." It was signed not by the flickering elder who had judged them, but by all 7 members of the eternal thrones. That night, Evangeline stood once more in the tower chamber, but this time Cassius stood beside her. They looked out over the grounds of Blackthorn Manor, at the home they had claimed together, at the future that stretched ahead of them, not as a prison, but as a choice made real. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Any of it?" She considered the question seriously. Her mortality was gone. Her life in the mortal world was forfeit. She would never see daylight again, never age, never experience the ordinary comfort of a human existence. She would spend forever in darkness, forever bound to a man who had once been a curse given form. "No," she said, "not for a moment." She took his hand, and they stood together as the moon rose over Blackthorn Manor, as the seasons continued their eternal rotation, as the world beyond their walls changed and reformed and became something new. Somewhere in the foundations of the manor, trapped in its stone and mortar, Isabeau experienced the agony of witnessing a love she had tried desperately to prevent flourish anyway. And in the library below, Evangeline's journal remained open on the desk, the final entry written in her careful hand. "I have lived many nights now in Blackthorn Manor, and I will live many more. Cassius once asked me if I understood the cost of eternity, and I told him yes. But I don't think I truly understood until now. The cost of eternity is that you must choose, again and again, for the rest of forever. You cannot rely on habit or comfort or the assumption that yesterday's love will sustain today's. Every night you must wake and decide again. Every night you must choose the darkness and the man who walks in it with you, but that is also the beauty of eternity. Every night is an opportunity to choose better, to love deeper, to become more fully yourself. Every night is a beginning, and I choose this. I choose him. I choose this darkness, this manner, this strange and beautiful curse that transformed into something sacred. I choose forever. I choose love." The candles burned low in the tower chamber. The winter wind howled through the grounds of Blackthorn Manor, carrying with it the promise of eternal nights and the echoing memory of a curse that had finally, at last, been broken. Not by magic, but by the simple, radical act of choosing each other. In the darkness, 2 immortal hearts beat in synchronization. In the darkness, a monster and a woman had found their salvation. And in the darkness, they would remain forever choosing, forever loving, forever free.